All right, so where are we at now? We've got our student controller. We have our student, our view under student. We have this index view, and this is it here. Our student controller calls the view for this. And again, remember under where say in the index, I can say view, and I can actually specify index if I want there. And I'm going to want in just a sec. Just so that's going to go. Oops, it's going to go to my index controller and run this. Now look at this. So this has a bunch of HTML tags, creates a table, has a for each that loops through the table, has another table for the headings up here and stuff like that, and is actually just getting information for the ID and the name and the credits from the students here. And so it wants data passed into it. And at the top is the data model passed into this is an IEnumerable type of my student model here. And again, IEnumerable is just another name for a generic interface to a view, an array or a list. So it needs a list of students passed into this. So if I were to actually run this, it's going to give me an error. If I go to, and again, I have to go to /student, and it'll give me an error, and it says null reference, object reference not set to an instance of the object. So it's trying to loop through all the data in my model, all the items in my data model, and I didn't pass in a data model here. So that's what I have to do. In my student controller, what it expects me to do is say view, pass in the name of the view, and then comma, and pass in a list of students for this. Now, eventually we're going to create a repository class for that, but just for testing purposes, I'm going to add a list of students here. So how do I declare a list of students again? List of student model. Equals new student. Yeah, that looks good for this. So I don't have a name here. So yeah. My students. Okay. All those errors that I just was forgetting to put in a name. Okay, so now I have it, and I can add some students to my list. My students dot add and call my constructor for my student model. And I pass, what were my things? I pass in an ID, which is an integer, 1001, pass in a name, and then pass in a credits, like 12 credits. I need to do a new here, new student model. Okay, so that's my code to declare a new student. And again, I want to maybe do a couple students so I can see my list here, give them each a slightly different ID number. I'd like to do, you can do ID numbers 1, 2, 3. I like to do them like 1001 and 1002, that because then when I display it on the screen and something or debugging it, if I see 1001, I know it's an ID rather than an index or something like that. So I always use kind of strange ID numbers when I'm doing this. I'm going to do different credits. Put some different names in here. All right. So now I have my students. I'm going to pass that into my array here, into my view. So my view is going to get this list of students. Yeah. Eventually, we don't want to hard code our student right into this view list. We'll move it in just a sec, but we'll see. So I've got that set up. Now, if I run this, and I'm patient, here, there's my view. If I go to students slash student, I should see my students, an HTML page displaying all my students here. So that's where we want to be but now none of these other buttons are going to work yet. The add, delete, all that stuff probably isn't going to work yet, but those are my students. So this, again, I'm creating a student list, passing it into in my index view into passing it my students, and then my index controller, again, the data model is the student model, and it actually creates a table and gets the heading names for everything and displays those, and then it goes through a loop through each item in my data model, and for each item displays item name, item ID, and item credits in a header, in a table to display this, and then displays some information about edit, delete, and that sort of stuff, these things. So see if you can get that working. So we're getting students to view here. Okay, the next thing we want to do is step 5 is to do a detail view. Let's just see that it doesn't work right now. So now if I were to click on details for one of these students, so I want details on Tom, it's going to crash. It says details not found. The following locations were searched, and it's looking at /view/student/details.cs.html. It's not finding a detail view. So that's what we're going to next do, is add that. So I'm going to stop here. So back in my code, in my controller here, I created the index view. Now there's a details view right below it. I want to do that here. So I'm going to right click and say add view. Again, I'm going to do a razor view, not an empty view, razor view. And it's going to let me bring up details the same. The template will be not delete, details. So we want to display the details. The first one we did a list. We want to list all the students. This time we want to say the details on one student. And again, my student model is here. So I want to do that and then add that view for that. Okay.
Why would we say
why we're not using what? Razor?
no, we're not using the razor tool, but eso
Right, the empty view. So Razor is Microsoft method to kind of integrate data in our HTML stuff. And there are some nice templates in here that'll let us quickly create base websites to do that. And so that's why we're doing Razor View now, because it'll let us create like an edit page or a delete page or a details page based on this data model very quickly there. So it just lets us set up these. And again, it just gives you a starting page, and then you can go in, you'd have to modify it later, to fit whatever look you want here. So we create our student view. And again, now with the index view, the thing at the top was an IEnumerable of the student model. So a list, IEnumerable is just an interface to the list, a list of the student model. In details, we just want one student. It is just, the model is just a single student. So in our controller here, when we call that view, again, we want to call details. And then as a parameter, we're just going to pass in a student here. So I'm just going to say my students sub 0. Always pass in the first student in the list. Except this is a list, and I'm doing it C# list dot get my students. Oh, I see, Bob. Yeah, I created this locally here. Let's just make a new student. I'm just gonna pass in a new student to this. Let's just student, yeah, student model. You might not even want to do this. I'm just going to do it temporarily, and then we're going to do a real student. Okay, so I'm going to create a student and pass that student into this view just to see one. So I'm just going to hard code a student in here. I should probably be putting, I'm doing a lot of technical debt here, so I should probably be commenting this with some to-dos. Don't hard code a student here. And up here, I certainly don't want to be having a list here. To do move to a repository, which we'll do in just a sec. Okay, so right now I'm creating a student and passing it to my details view. So I'm gonna run this. Go to my student. I need to add student to my menu. I haven't done that yet. Okay. Here's my students. I can click on details and it'll show me details on one student. I can go back to the list. Unfortunately, if I click on a different student, if I click on Jen and say details, it still shows me Tom. Because I get that. I just hard coded to always show me Tom. So whatever student you pick, it's always going to show you Tom right now. So let's update this a little bit. But again, it just creates, this is just a generic template. We can certainly modify this, but we're not going to. But in design, you would. So again, we don't want to be, I mean, this is no way to be managing a list of students here, right? So where do we want to do? We want to probably be pulling this from a database and managing it there. So we want a separate class to do that. We're not actually going to tie into a database today. I think there's already enough complexity, but we'll create another class to manage this list here. So under data model, under the models, let's create a new class. And we generally would call it student repository or student repo. I'm going to say student repository. That anytime you say student repository or student repo, that usually means some sort of data access class in a lot of languages. And now I'm going to go back to my student control. I'm just going to move all that. I'm going to copy this stuff. I'm just going to move it to my repository. So now, so I'm going to declare my list of students. I'm going to need a constructor here to put some of this code in. So I'm going to do my, again, public student repository constructor here. And I'm going to initialize my student list inside that. Now I'm going to need back here my student controller. I'm going to need a list of all my students. So my repository, one of my methods, I need a public method to get all my students. Public, I'm gonna, I'm just gonna call it get all students, to get the list of all students. And I'm just gonna return my list of students, my students. So it's going to be the return type is going to be a list of students. So it's going to be get all students is going to return a list of students, and it's going to say return my students here. I don't really like the word my students here. I'm going to rename that. I'm just going to call it students. In my mind, that's what it should be. Okay. I'm going to have a list called students. It would be a list of student models. I'm going to return students there. I'm going to add to it, hard code it. And again, this is where I would probably, in a normal thing, I'd be going out to my database and getting my list of students, doing SQL query or whatever, bring it down, and then converting that return type into a list of students here. Object relation mat, ORM, and I'd create a list of students based on that database access. But we're not going to do that. We're just going to do our list of students hard-coded here. Okay, so that's my list of students. That's my student controller. So now in my student controller, I'm not going to, when I say return, I'm going to want to use my repository. I need a repository up here. So I'm going to declare a student repository. Oh, you know what? I did something wrong. In my student repository, it was a class, and my classes should start with an uppercase letter, and I didn't. I'm just going to rename that. Otherwise, it's going to bother me. Okay, so I'm going to rename that everywhere and do that. Okay, that's happier. Classes should always start with a capital letter. Okay, so student repository equals new student repository. So there's my student repository for this. And now, once I have that student, I'm just going to, and the variable, I'm going to call it the student repo. So, okay, student repo. And then in here, I'm just going to say student repo dot get all students. So that's going to get a list of all my students that I'm going to pass to the index. So again, rather than hard coding all the students in this, I moved them to my student repository. I declared a variable called students in my constructor. I hard coded this, and I added a get all students, a public class that returns that list. Now I declare a student repo, instantiate it, and then I'd say student repo dot get all students and send that to my index. Does that make sense? One thing, if you get kind of lost here, I'm trying to follow the exact same code that's here where you click completed stuff. Uh, if you look inside that class and like if I go into models, there's my student repository. It might not be exactly the same, but it's got it, here's my thing, here my student thing, here's my code. And well, some of this stuff we'll get to in a sec. And here's my get all students here for this, return that. So again, some of this stuff is already there. If you want, so down at the bottom is the complete working full version of what we end up with today, just so you know. Okay, let's do one more thing here. For details, we hard coded a student here. We want to just get one student. So I'm going to delete this. I want to use my student repo here. and I'm given the ID of a student, I want to use my student repo and say, like, get student by ID and specify the ID and get a student. Fortunately, I don't have a get student ID defined. Here, I should be able to right click and generate one. I could do that. Or I can just go to my student repository and generate one myself. Public. It's going to return a single student model. And it's going to be get student by ID. And it's going to take in an integer that is an an integer that's an ID. Now I have to find my ID, my student. I have to look. So I have a list of students. I have to find that student by ID here. I'm just going to copy this code. Well, here. I'm going to copy this code and see if it makes sense to you. So again, I'm cheating. I'm going to the solution that I have here. So I'm going to loop through all the students in my list of students. So for each student model named student in students, I'm going to check if the student ID equals the ID I'm given here, and if so, return that student here. Now, this gets me into trouble because if I don't find the student, I'm not returning anything. So I'm going to I'm going to have a default if we can't just if we can't find the student, I'm going to return a null student. And I'm going to have a separate method here to create a null student. Where is that here? I find this, where's my null student method? Here. I sometimes find it helpful in these things just to have another method for generating a default student, an empty student here. So it's Chris creates a empty student with a -1 as the ID, null student at 9999 there, and return it. So that's right, return there. Now, of course, this is how I would generate the code. It's certainly not the best way. You can, so collections like indexes have a find method. I can actually replace this all with this find in students. Use student.find and find the place where the SID, the student ID is equal to ID given, and it will do that. So you can actually do this here, but I'm just gonna not use that one. I mean, this one should work, but again, this one is something you can understand, so we'll just use that one for now. Okay, so I'm finding a student, returning it, getting it, passing it to my details. Now I can run this, hopefully, and let's see if this all going to work. So I'm going to go to really should have added students to my menu. Students, here's my student. Now if I click on details for Jen, it brings up null student. It brings up details for Tom, null student. So somehow my list is not getting there to the student yet. So it's calling the student thing, but the ID is not getting passed correctly. for this. And what happens, the problem actually is in the index one. So if I go back to my index controller, there is actually some code in here for edit, delete, and details. I need to pass the ID of things back. And it is actually commented out here because we weren't implementing that code yet. And I'm going to uncomment this for all three because eventually, well, today I guess we're not going, but I mean, normally I would implement all three. So we just have to make sure that when you click on details, we send the ID from the of the item clicked on back to the controller. So this is what that does. So now if I save this, go to there. Oops, where are their build errors? Oh, yeah. And by default, it doesn't know what the ID was, but it is just the ID field. What is it's item dot ID. 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 That's what I want. Okay, let's see if that will work. So now hopefully the everything stringing this together will be, if I go to my student controller and I click on details for one person, it should display that person's details because it will pass the ID back to the controller and the controller will send it here. And I go back to my list, I can look up someone else's details and go back. This is all we're going to do today. I know some of you are going to want to try out the edit and deletes on your own. So if you want to do that, I think they're in the video. They're in the solution code here. Just a couple quick mentions of that. One thing that is a little different from that is, so index is just one action in the controller. Details are just one action in the controller. Create is just one action in the controller. I mean, create is two, because again, it brings up a new screen where you can enter in a new student, and then you hit an action, and then it will create the new student here. So there's what is called both a get and a post. The get is the initial screen. The post is after you hit the button to add a student. Same with delete or edit. There's a get and a post, and we do different code in different places. So like with create, here we'll show the view and send it to one student. We'll do something, basically, we would do this. Oh no, we again, we're just creating a blank student. We don't have to get, so we just read. But here we'd actually add a student. And so under like student repository, so we've got a get all students, we get student ID. We're going to need a add student or create student. We need all the CRUD, an update student and a delete student objects there. And so if you look at the code here in the student repository, the file store, this is get all students, get student by ID, get one student by index, the null student, add a student to the list, delete a student, update a student. So all of those are available here in this repository. And then in the controller, if I go to the controllers and student controller, so like under create, we do this, but under create here, we create a new student model, and then from the form, we get the ID and name and credits of that the user typed in, and we create a new student based on those, and we add that student to the list here. We also, same with edit, we display that student, we send, we get the student by ID and send it to edit, and then once they edit it, we update the student in the list. And then again, so then we also need control. I mean, those are our controllers. We'll need views for each one of those. And again, when you do razor views, there are templates for delete and edit and create. There are those templates already there. But again, the whole idea here is just to get you kind of familiar, a little bit thinking about model view controllers. And what this is just one example of a model view controller. So again, we have our data model, our student model, and our repository. We have our controllers, which controls the actions back and forth, and then we have our views, which is in this case, the HTML of that. See, it would be nice if you got to this as far as we were talking about today, where you were able to do index and details. That'd be wonderful. If you have it's further along, get as far as you can. This is just a learning activity. We want you to go through that. There's a video here that walks you through the whole thing in Visual Studio. It looks like I have videos for the VS Code. I'll try to update those here too. All right.